Lately, I've been thinking about how often we feel the need to narrate ourselves. Not in a loud way, not always consciously, but in the small, habitual ways we try to justify our choices. Soften boundaries, maybe rehearse reasons, or add extra context that no one really asked for. It's subtle, it slips into conversations unnoticed most of the times. A sentence that keeps going a little bit too long, an explanation offered preemptively, as if silence might be misread as guilt or confusion or distance. I don't think this comes from dishonesty. I think it comes from care, from wanting to be seen accurately, from not wanting to be misunderstood, and yet, somewhere along the way, that care starts to feel heavy. You could feel it in your body as this almost physical tiredness that shows up after certain conversations, or this sense of relief when you finally stop talking and let the moment just pass, right? Without this need for clarifying. There's a strange threshold you cross at some point where explaining yourself starts to begin, to feel less like communication and more like this need of performance. And it's not because the other person is hostile necessarily, but maybe because we start to realize they're not really listening for an understanding. Maybe they're listening for reassurance or alignment or something that keeps their picture of you intact. So, what stays with me is the idea that presence can eventually replace introductions, that over time, through consistency and restraint in the way you move through ordinary days, people begin to feel who you are before you say anything at all. And it's not because you've made yourself impressive, but maybe because you made yourself coherent. Your actions repeat, your values show up, your choices stop contradicting each other. That kind of presence isn't very dramatic, right? It doesn't really announce itself. It maybe settles into a room more kindly, almost imperceptibly, like a temperature shift you only notice once and it's already happened. And once it's there, words start to feel optional. Not unnecessary in every case, but no longer urgent. I think about how long it takes to build that, how much patience it requires, how unglamorous it could be. It's built through showing up the same way when no one is watching, through not correcting every misinterpretation, through letting some people be wrong about you even when you know you could set the record straight if you wanted to. I think that's the part that still feels uncomfortable to admit is that, sometimes being misunderstood hurts less than constantly having to explain yourself to people who were never trying to understand you in the first place. There's a quiet grief in realizing that, I don't know, clarity doesn't always lead to connection. Sometimes it just leads to more questions or more scrutiny or more distance. And so you start to notice which explanations feel like this intimacy and which feels like this erosion almost. Like which conversations leave you more grounded or which ones leave you replaying your words later, right? Editing them in your head, imagining, how could they have landed differently if you just phrase things different ways. I've noticed how often misunderstanding isn't really about confusion. I feel like it's more of this resistance, right? Accepting someone as they often requires setting aside our egos, certainty, or a long-held assumptions that we always held on to. And not everyone wants to do that work, right? Sometimes it's easier just to misread someone than to really see them and to see the quiet ways they cared, the effort they put into small things, the depth that doesn't really announce itself. So when this happens, explaining yourself can start to feel like asking for permission just to exist the way that you already do. There's always something about time that changes all of this. Over time, your reputation begins to arrive before you do. It's not a story that people are going to tell loudly, right? But a sense people carry. and expectation, shaped by how you've moved consistently, how you've treated others, how you've handled yourself when it would have been easier to react or perform. At that point, explanations feel redundant, right? The people who have watched you closely don't really need that reassurance from you. They already know what you stand for, and the people who haven't been paying attention wouldn't be convinced anyway. Now, I don't think this means never explaining yourself. Real relationships still require care, context, and patience. There are moments when explanation is this form of closeness, when, it deepens that trust instead of draining it. But there are moments, that feel different. They're quieter, more mutual, they don't always come from this panic or self doubt. What I'm trying to circling around is the difference between speaking from confidence and speaking from fear, between sharing and justifying, between offering context and trying to secure approval. I've been noticing how much energy explaining takes, how it really pulls the attention away from doing, from living, from letting things unfold at their own pace, and how often it keeps us in our own heads instead of our bodies, monitoring these perceptions instead of inhabiting ourselves fully. It's just, there's a relief that comes from letting some things remain unexplained, with trusting that the right people will feel the truth of who you are without this detailed breakdown, with allowing silence to do some of the work. This isn't something you decide all at once, and it happens very gradually. It's almost too accidental, right? It's like one less explanation here, a pause instead of a clarification there, and slowly, you start to realize nothing really collapses when you don't fill the spaces. So in fact, something steadier starts to form. I don't know exactly where that line is. I'm still learning when to speak, when to let things stand as they are, but I do know that the more grounded I feel in myself, the less I feel the urge to convince anyone of anything. And maybe that's the art of not explaining yourself, really, is not withdraw, not indifference, not superiority, but a quiet trust that who you are, lived honestly over time, will speak clearly enough on its own, even if not everyone hears it.